alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Hello and welcome to Alive After Reading. I'm Tim Niederreiter, and with me today is a special guest for this very special episode of Alive After Reading, J. Daniel Sawyer. Welcome back to the show, Dan.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
And today we have a special episode. This is probably going to be airing in a special time, too, not on the usual Sunday show, so don't worry, you'll be getting your Sunday episode soon, folks. Well, whenever the next Sunday is, because we got many in the can at this point, so never fear.
There are many Sundays, but this one is mine.
Oh boy, that's kind of creepy. What do you do on your Sunday? Anyway, never mind. Probably best left Probably better left undisclosed. Okay. So Dan, I wanted to do a special episode with you. I mean, you're a great podcaster. You do a lot of good writing yourself, too. I'm sorry. I just was blanking because, whatever.
Well, thank you.
Too much laughing. It's driven me insane temporarily.
Well, that's part of the point, isn't it?
Yeah, that enormous, I shouldn't have interrupted it, but that enormous, evil, diabolical laugh there. Yeah, you do a very good one of those, too.
Thank you.
A good evil laugh, yes. Okay, so... so I ran into this issue that I didn't realize I was having, kind of thing, lately with my writing, and so I sent this question to you for your podcast, The Everyday Novelist, and just for the but I wanted to do a special episode about it here too, because we do talk a lot about craft on this show. I mean, I do. I ask many questions about craft because that's my bailiwick kind of thing, and I think it's best to describe what happened to me on last Tuesday. Yes, for me it was Tuesday. Okay. Where I started writing this book on Monday. I'm like, okay, this book is a new book that I was just writing for fun because I needed to clear some cobwebs, right? I do that sometimes. Mm-hmm. And I started writing this new book, and I said, let's just do the easiest thing I can imagine. And for some people, that's like the Simpsons line. It's like playing a burning guitar with your teeth. No, but I did so I'm going to write in this fantasy setting. It's urban fantasy, but it's also kind of space opera, but it's also high fantasy. It's all these things at once. Just because that's one of my favorite settings of mine.
It's what I call kitchen sink fantasy.
It's kind of kitchen sinky, yes. Because it takes place all in like the afterlife, stuff like that. It's very strange. So, anyway, in a multiverse, whatever, and and so I was thinking, okay, let's just do that. But let's use one of my favorite plots, and I didn't realize it was one of my favorite plots when I thought about it. Like, I'll just use my go-to thing, which I have, and that's changed a few times over the years. But my go-to thing is generally some kind of intense, dramatic, romantic conflict at the core of the story that involves, possibly physical violence as well. In fact, usually does involve the potential for physical violence at the very least. So that I realized that I've been avoiding that for a while, and it made me kind of uncomfortable to realize that I've been unconsciously trying to not do that for maybe 2 or 3 books.
Now, by potential physical violence, are you talking about 2 lovers wind up fighting? Or are you talking about rape, or what are you talking about?
I mean, it can be as general as including both of those, but it could be
okay.
But it's mostly violence between lovers is the main thing. Is a major factor, yeah. Mm-hmm. And for some other ulterior motive, not like just one of them hauls off and goes crazy and whatever, because they've got to be both sympathetic characters. We can't do this as like a. I mean, that is still important to me that the story be good by my definitions. Be like the characters need to be, if they're the main characters, one of them can't be a complete ogre. That would not work out. So like for example, this book I was writing the first few scenes, the main characters. The one character is trying to track down the other one. The male character is trying to track down his ex, basically, whatever. This is kind of how I've started a couple of these stories in the past. This kind of construction, not with the man necessarily, but just whatever. One of the characters is trying to track down the other ones. They get into an altercation pretty early on in this book because this book starts pretty close to they actually run into each other pretty early. And so, but the first day I was writing the book, it was Monday, I wrote the first 3,000 words. I'm like, okay, that's pretty cool. And the next day I wrote 7,000 words.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a huge jump for me. I mean, even though I'm capable of doing a lot of words and dictating now, and it's even when I try to slow down and take it more carefully, which I've been doing, it's 7,000 is still a good chunk of words, and
it's
a
a very good count for a day.
It just flew by, and I realized there's something to this. It's like I was doing what I was meant to do. Was the feeling I got there.
Yes,
and that's kind of what made me kind of alternately a little disturbed and kind of like, oh no, I hit on something. This is something I like to do, and I'm good at. I think anyway. I at least have the potential to be good at it, even if I'm not yet. Because I've done a lot of practice at it. So anyway, my point is, I definitely feel a little uncomfortable writing and talking about that subject, though.
Mm-hmm.
So that's basically what prompted me to reach out to you, both here and on your podcast, about how do you. I mean, because I find that most of the subjects that I'm interested in are also things that embarrass me or make me feel like maybe I shouldn't be interested in that.
Mm-hmm.
You know? Yeah. So do you have any thoughts so far?
Yeah, I do. This is something that trips up a lot of people, both on the reading and on the writing end. So let me ask you a couple of questions. Without getting too specific or personal, do you have direct experience in your life, either firsthand or second or third hand, with friends, family, with violence or sexual violence or criminality or greed or anything like that?
I mean, define greed. That's otherwise probably basically no. Not really.
Larceny. Sorry, larceny.
Larceny, stealing. Oh, actually, I do actually have some of those. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, a little bit, not much though, honestly.
All right. So that's kind of the answer I was expecting. There's this rabbinic concept from rabbinic Judaism called building a hedge around the Torah. And the basic idea is that the commandments that God gave the Jewish people, they're good and all, they're pretty specific, but there are some parts of life that no matter how clear a commandment is, you can't quite be sure because it's a gray area. And if you really want to be careful about not transgressing, what you do is you need to set your own personal boundaries back from what you know, back a few feet from what you know is definitely breaking the rules. That way you're safe. Well, when this happens in a culture, you get a generational buildup effect. So the next generation views the hedge that they've built, that the previous generation has built around the Torah to keep themselves from transgressing. They view that as the actual rule. So they set their hedge further and further back successively over generations. In our culture in the United States, we have had, up until right now, literally until right now as we're recording this, we've had basically 80 years of safety.
Yeah.
There have been a few bumps. There was the terror of the Cold War. There was seeing Vietnam on TV. There was September 11th. But for the most part, we've had an unhistorically safe time. The safest, most prosperous time in all of history. When that happens, you get hedges around the Torah being built in outward radiating concentric circles over 5 generations now, because very few of us, statistically speaking, have contact with reality.
Mm-hmm.
The reality of human nature is that in addition to our many fantastic, beautiful qualities, rationality, aesthetics, communal bonding, familial and filial love, music, all the ability to build a civilization. In addition to all these wonderful qualities, we are also, each and every one of us, predators. And we have all of the dark impulses that go with that. And those that have strong impulses become sheep or sheepdogs, or they become wolves, but they are never able to be among the sheep. So they're the people that go into the military, that go into the police, that become the safe person in their social group for people who have been raped or mugged or whatnot to go to when they don't know what to do. But because the civilians, the normal people who don't have those dark impulses quite as strongly and who have not walked through the dark places themselves, sit behind this set of hedges, they begin to think that thinking the dark thoughts is a small half step away from doing the dark deeds.
Yeah.
And that's why you get blue noses, people who are censorious, people who, I just had a conversation online a couple of weeks ago with someone who was slagging off Piers Anthony because he must have been a pedophile.
Oh, yeah.
Piers Anthony was not a pedophile. Piers Anthony was a man who lived through the pedophile panic in the 80s and personally paid for the legal and counseling bills of people that had been molested by his colleagues. And he was really, he was in a culture that didn't have a context for this. And so in his fiction, you can see it starting about 86, going to about 93 or 94, different sorts of adult-child sexual attractions, temptations, interactions, from molestation to flirtations that are safely contained to explorations of propriety, show up really regularly in his fiction because he's trying to work out why this is so hurtful to people and how it can happen so regularly, even though it is so hurtful to people. Fiction is the space where we safely explore the parts of life that we will never be able to fully escape.
Okay.
We've got a safe society, but that safe society is built on this sort of mutually assured destruction contract of trust and censure that are all bundled together. But that doesn't mean the impulses are gone. The murderous impulses, the predatory impulses are always there. And in order to become the kind of person who would never act on those, even by accident, even by getting overwhelmed, at some point you have to face them in yourself. And you can do that by writing them out. You can do that by reading the explorations of other people. But fiction and drama are the place in which we do this. And in American culture, we're very, very comfortable doing that with fake violence.
Yeah.
We're less comfortable with real violence. And the difference between fake violence and real violence in a fictional context is how much of the actual psychology and emotion are involved. Blowing away the bad guy because, he's the bad guy.
Mm-hmm.
That's easy. That's fake. That's all archetypal. Blowing away the bad guy because he's wronged you and it's an act of revenge and you're taking satisfaction in his death, well, that's a little more uncomfortable, but most of us can still get behind that, at least in fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Taking pleasure in killing the bad guy. Oh, that's a step too far. That's too real. But the thing is that when you talk to any veteran or any cop who's had to shoot somebody or any civilian who's been in a position where they've had to kill in self-defense, one of the most difficult parts of doing that is that in addition to being justifiable and scary and terrifying and upsetting, it's pleasurable.
Yeah. No, I mean,
it's pleasurable because we're predators.
Yeah.
But when you go there, that makes
chemically for it.
Right. Exactly. And I was talking at a science fiction convention. There was I got to meet Rory Miller, who's the author of several books for writers on violence. He and a panel of professional killers were giving a talk on violence. And by professional killers, I mean SEAL team snipers, police snipers, people that have worked for special forces in different capacities, people who've all got a body count.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things they got to talking about was that the first thing you do after combat, especially after you've either narrowly avoided being killed or you've killed somebody, is you basically have sex with the nearest warm body. It's such a primal impulse. They call it in, I'm going to swear, so bleep this out if that's not okay on your podcast.
That's good.
Okay. Um, there's we all learn in grade school about the fight or flight response.
Mm-hmm.
As we get older, we begin to figure out that there's a third option: freeze.
Mm-hmm.
Everything's too dangerous. You freeze up. You can't figure out how to move. It's actually a 4-prong. It's fight, flight, freeze, or fuck.
Yeah.
That's really uncomfortable for people because, and the reason my theory about American culture and the reason that violence is so easy to categorize off as fantasy and sex isn't, is that we're in a society where violence is very, very rare. So it's easy to make it a subject of fantasy. But we all have sex and we all have sexuality all the time. We can't escape our sexuality. So that gets down to the core of us a lot quicker. And so that's more threatening when we write about it or when we read about it.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. And I can see where that's happening. And it also makes sense that because I said I don't have much experience with violence, but I actually have been in not like real fights, but like when I was a kid, I got into fights all the time. Mm-hmm. And some of them were actually fairly violent with siblings or people I didn't really people at school, that kind of thing. I haven't done that since I was a kid, really. But there's still this level of like my temper was always bad. That's what they always said, that kind of thing. And I was raised Catholic too, Catholic and Presbyterian. It's a long story, but either way, these things I see totally how this applies to me now, and it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it's fascinating.
And in the mean, there's basically 3 approaches you can take toward the darkness as an artist or even as a thinking person. The first is to say, look, it's better kept in the box. So don't induce in your readers, don't induce in yourself thoughts that might take you to the dark place, because that might make you act. Then there's the sort of convention approach, which is, well, I'm just not going to transgress the standards of the community. What I feel like is a little too far is probably just a little too far for everyone, and I'm going to color within the lines. The third way of looking at it is the way that I look at it. And it's not that those other 2 ways are not without merit. It's that I have a different perspective, and that's what I'm here to advance. So that's what I'm doing. My perspective is that, or my approach is that someone who does not wrestle with their demons in a safe situation is not a safe person to be around in a dangerous one. And I would rather be in a room under threat with a whole bunch of Quentin Tarantino fans than with a whole bunch of Disney fans.
Oh, yeah.
I can see
how that applies. Yeah, go on.
Because part of this comes from having been literally under fire myself a few times in the civilian world. I grew up in bad neighborhoods, and I grew up in the Bay Area, so I've traveled in and through cults. I've dealt with, I've had interactions with the family of Marion Zimmer Bradley while that was all still secret, and so I've seen a lot of evil, ugly shit firsthand, which is how I kind of come to my perspective. I am uncomfortable around people who are nice, because nice people don't know what they're capable of, so they can be moved to actions they can't control much easier by the right kind of pressure. Therefore, in my stories, whether they're light and funny stories or whether they're dark stories, whether they're soft and gentle and uplifting, one of the elements that goes in there, whether I want it to or not, is the wrestling with the darkest parts of the self. Because someone who's done that and then is under pressure, they know what they're capable of, which means they can decide whether or not to do it. Someone who doesn't know what they're capable of cannot be trusted to handle temptation they're not used to.
Yeah.
Or provocation they're not used to.
That makes sense because it's like any skill kind of thing in a way.
Right. Exactly.
When you're new at something, you're almost always bad at it, if not always. And so handling the temptation that's new is going to be very difficult, almost impossible.
Exactly. And that's one of the reasons that my young adult fiction tends to be thematically edgier than a lot of young adult fiction. A lot of young adult fiction written now tends to be edgy on the action level.
Yeah.
Mine tends to be edgy on the thematic level because my theory about young adult fiction is that the difference between a 10-year-old who reads middle grade and a 14-year-old who reads young adult is that the 14-year-old has recently acquired, unasked, the ability to create life and the ability to end it.
Mm-hmm.
And that is existentially terrifying. And so young adult fiction, among its other purposes culturally, should give the new teenager a mental landscape in which to begin to cope with these two incredible and terrifying powers that they can't unget.
Yeah.
Someone of adult stature can kill someone, even a small adult woman can kill someone by accident if they're sufficiently angry.
Right.
Someone of adult hormonal stature can impregnate someone or get pregnant unintentionally because their emotions run away with them. And people have to be allowed to grow up, and one of the best ways to do that is to give them simulations that they can run to get to know themselves.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I mean, when I was a teenager, I mean, I just turned 30 this year. When I was a teenager, I read a lot of Orson Scott Card, and I thought that was pretty helpful at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Especially because Card's also a religious person, and at the time I was quite religious myself. So it makes sense. It was a very sensible kind of like this fit with who I was at the time, and it made sense to me then. And a lot of it still, to me, resonates pretty well. Especially the early Ender books and that kind of thing. But well, Ender's Game and Ender's Shadow specifically.
Yep.
But which Ender's Shadow isn't really one of the early ones. Never mind. So, because you wrote that like 10 years after the first one, I think.
Yeah, I don't know the chronology. I encountered them far too late, so I think I've read Ender's Game and I've got the others on my shelf, but I haven't got to them yet.
Well, Ender's Shadow is just for perspective, because this actually is relevant to the conversation.
Okay.
Ender's Shadow is coterminous with Ender's Game, basically. It takes place at the same time. It's from a different point of view. It's from Bean's point of view, if you've read the first
Gotcha.
Book. So, but his story is actually even darker than Ender's, because he was an orphan.
Nice.
Basically, he was like on the streets, and he thinks he's an orphan. He's actually something weirder. But he ends up he's from the streets of, I think, Rotterdam. He's from Europe, but it's like this weird. And then there's this other villain character that isn't in Ender's Game, that is like his nemesis, who appears in some of the later books with him as well, because they're separate series. They diverge completely after the first that first joint pair of books. So anyway, it's fascinating because the violence in the Ender books is much actually more. I mean, it's because in Ender's Game, if you remember this, because Ender kills a couple other characters in the course of that book, and he doesn't realize he's done it in some cases. So this is very interesting as a YA book. It makes perfect sense there, even though it's kind of, I mean, the ages are not quite correct for what we call YA nowadays. Not quite the same. But it sounds like it's more in the category that you would fall into there in some ways, as far as how it handles that dark side.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, I grew up on juvenile books. All of the juvenile books I grew up on fell into that category. Aside from maybe the Hardy Boys, right? The Hardy Boys, Tom Swift, those were popcorn entertainment and a lot of fun. But I read. There's the Heinlein juveniles, the Wrinkle in Time, the Narnia books. No matter how soft or hard these books are, they're all about dealing with the terrifying aspects of growing up.
Right.
The dark parts that, the pit that you dare not gaze into, but have to in order to grow up.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, this is probably getting too personal, but I feel like I've not fully grown up. That's part of my life as I stand now. I mean, I'm 30 years old, but I feel like I never really became an adult, which is weird. But I'm not sure if it's weird. Maybe that's normal, actually. I don't know. Well,
it's if I'm trying to phrase this so we don't get into demography, because that's a
Sure.
big topic. But the economic and social climate you grew up in was almost geared to prevent people from growing up.
Mhm.
You know, it wasn't financially possible for most people your age to get married or have children at anything like a reasonable age. Your generation, by and large, was actively discouraged from taking risks when you were young enough that the risks didn't have big consequences. Um, your generation typically wasn't left alone very often to self-police. The fact that you got into fistfights is like a major plus in your favor as far as acquiring the tools to grow up. But yeah, it's a common thing with people your age that you don't quite feel like you've grown up. But writing the kind of stories you're talking about writing is one of the ways to do that, because you have to face the parts of yourself, even in an indirect fashion.
Mhm.
you and you have to cope with the unfolding of a chain of logic. One of the other markers of adulthood is understanding consequences beyond the first or second order, and following a chain of logic into dark places is one of the ways you get practice doing that.
Okay. So it seems like I'm probably on the right track here. I want to talk about one other thing before we wrap this up, though, because this is some
Sure.
fascinating stuff. But I want to ask you about the writing side of it, because we have strayed
Hmm.
a little bit into, not strayed, but we've gone into deep into the psychology side. And on the
Hmm.
writing side, I wonder why it feels so much easier to write the stories that are darker and maybe more difficult mentally or psychologically to write.
Oh, well, that's because once you open that gate, there's so much there that's dying to come out. It's
Okay.
easier to get into a flow state. The deeper you tap, and it's not just the darkness, but the deeper you tap into the pieces of yourself that you don't show in public, whether they're the dark pieces or the secret passions and loves and exaltations, the deeper you tap into that, the less conscious intermediation you have to do when it goes to the page.
Ah.
Because you don't have there's no opportunity for contrivance, because there's so much there at the center of your being that it flows out as long as you let it.
So it's more honest in a sense than the artifice
Mm-hmm.
that you can craft around the ancillary material kind of thing, the stuff that's not as
Right,
important.
right. And and art reaches its apex when the artifice is um is the shaper to that raw channeled core of the self type of energy. And I'm not using energy in a psycho spiritual way, just in
Hmm.
terms of the amount of emotion that you've got bottled up down deep in your core.
Yeah, that would explain a lot about the sort of stories that interest me, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, I know some of the things, and for years though, I was struggling. Like, am I interested in anything? Was the feeling I had sometimes. Partially
Mm-hmm.
because I was dealing with depression, but also
Yep.
partially because I just was denying that I was interested in certain things that
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want
Yeah.
to write about that.
And I would venture a guess that the two are not unconnected.
Hmm.
Um, the depression can come from a lot of places, but one of the places it comes from is a pervasive frustration
Yes.
with a lack of ability to connect with reality. And part of the reality that most people are desperate to connect with is internal. If you don't know where your edges are, and you don't know where the edges of the world are, it's very hard to know who you are. And that kind of frustration and uncertainty breeds the sort of white noise depression that makes everything seem fake.
Wow, that is so on point. I mean, because for years would be like, I'm writing a book, and it was like the first 4 or 5 years after college, really. I felt like I'd write a book, and or as I'd be writing it, I'd realize this isn't what I. This just feels wrong. It feels bad. It feels
Mm-hmm.
worthless, dead on the page kind of thing.
Yep.
And maybe that was true, maybe it wasn't. But either way, I couldn't tell because I was in extreme funk for about 4 years after college.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's crazy. How accurate that is. Anyway, it always amazes me at least how how on point how spot on. It seems that the way you're not to just butter your biscuit or whatever, but you're pretty incisive. You cut to the core pretty well, and I admire that.
Oh, thank you. It's sort of my thing. I'm interested in how people and ideas and everything work and how the different layers of reality interact with each other. So, yeah, but this is the stuff I spend all my time thinking about.
Well, it shows. It's paying off.
Cool.
Well,
decades of work paying off.
Oh, hey, that's how I feel about my writing sometimes. You know, I've been writing for 20 years pretty steadily now, almost 20 years. So, well, not almost. It's been like 17 years, whatever. But who's counting? So, yeah. Thank you for being on the show, Dan. This has been fascinating. I hope we're going to have plugs in a second because after that awesome episode, you definitely deserve a little bit of promotion for your work and your podcast and stuff. But thank you so much for being on the show. It's always great to have you. And
always a pleasure.
Always illuminating too. You know, it's wow. I feel like I'm gonna have to think some things through. You know, a little more carefully, perhaps, or maybe less carefully. Maybe that's the moral of the story. Just dive into it. I don't know.
Probably a little of both. There's thinking,
first one or the other.
Yeah, well, there's thinking and then there's doing, and you need both, right?
Yeah.
You don't want the thinking and the doing to get each other in a deadlock.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Dan. Where can people find your stuff, and what should they be looking for from you?
Oh, you can find. I think the website's up to date. I'll have to check. You can find all of my stuff, or almost all of my stuff, at jdsawyer.net. I've got podcasts, both fiction and nonfiction, including my writing podcast, where I answer questions like this all the time, at everydaynovelist.com. You'll find blog posts on all sorts of topics, and you'll find my 30-odd books, most of which are fiction, some of which are nonfiction. I write mystery, science fiction, and fantasy. Both of the dark and serious and of the gonzo crazy funny variety. The Suave Rob series, which is the next Suave Rob book, is coming out in audiobook finally. The second one is a trilogy of books about a far future transgender Evel Knievel that surfs supernovas and busts up undersea cults and all sorts of funky stuff. Absolutely gonzo, balls out crazy. The Clark Lantham Mysteries are my longest series. They're about a private detective in the San Francisco Bay Area who's coping with tech culture. And then there's quite a few standalone hard SF and juvenile science fiction books, such as Hadrian's Flight and The Resurrection Junket. If you like your fiction chewy, whether you like it bright or dark, you'll probably find something you like in my stuff.
Absolutely. And as for this podcast, you can find us at mentalcellarpublications.com. You can find my books, including some books that fit the kind of form I talked about here, if that sounds interesting to you to read. Definitely check out Origin of Storms. That's the first Forces Vampire book, and it's enormous. It's a 166,000-word book. So, by my standards, that's pretty huge. It's my longest book. But that's science fiction, and it's very dark, and it's got this romantic element to it as well. Not very dark. It's weird, but anyway, it's got some darkness to it, and a lot of romance to it. And then I've got other books. Demon Scroll. It should have a new edition out soon because the first edition, I'll admit, wasn't up to my normal standards of editing. So the new one will be. So check that out. That's epic fantasy. So those are the main ones. Oh, 10 Liars. Don't forget 10 Liars. Also, that one has got some darkness. That's steampunk fantasy with summoning guns, basically, weapon summoning as the main magic system. So thanks for listening, everybody, and talk to you later.
That tears it.